G'day Year 12, welcome back to another video. We are looking today at starting our focus study on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians for our topic on social inclusion and exclusion. So this is lesson 6 today. Every lesson from here on out is going to be focusing on Aboriginal social inclusion and exclusion within Australia. We're going to be applying all our future lessons and knowledge to this case study, so make sure you highlight and date page 29, lesson 6 up the top here, and we'll get cracking. So, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. As a bit of a powerful intro to this focus study, what I'd like you to do is to watch this video here. It's titled "My People Die Young in This Country." It is talked by an Indigenous man by the name of Stan Grant. He's a journalist, a famous Aboriginal journalist, and he's doing a speech. This is part of a debate series, but he does this really powerful speech on "My People Die Young in This Country." So that's going to be our starting point for you to watch. I'll put that link in our description. So if you haven't watched that, pause me now and go and watch that now as your first point of call. This lesson is going to then look at a bit of an introduction on who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are, a bit of a historical background, just so you're aware of, I guess, I know you probably looked at a bit of this, but a lot of the stuff I did on this at uni was quite high level, so I think I will be imparting on a bit more knowledge than you may or may not have realised in the past. And then after that, we're going to look at a bit of a snapshot across all our SVRs, and compare them to non-Indigenous. So the first thing I think to get across is that Australia isn't just one country, or it was never just one country. If you look at a map of Europe, for example, I'll get one up, you'll get something like this. Now everyone is very clear that Europe itself is made up of a lot of different nations in a land mass that is slightly smaller, or roughly the size of, if you include things like Turkey and all the islands and peninsulas and stuff up here, it's probably roughly thereabouts the same size as Australia. Now we know that there's probably, I think there's probably 46 countries here, and we recognise that Spain, France, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, etc., England, and whatnot, are all separate countries in their own right. What we often forget is that in Australia, we had over 250 Indigenous nations on this country. And this map here is an example of that. We had over 800 dialects as well prior to 1788. So I think if we compare that to the extent that Europe is looking at, if we then look at Australia, we can see how amazingly diverse this country was at one stage. All of these border lines are essentially different nations, different Indigenous nations that existed on our country. Where we are, in Darkinjung Ku-ring-gai land, is just down here. Okay, a small fraction of a huge and massive landscape here. So I guess, to me, looking at this puts it a little bit into perspective of how much things have changed, but also I think how sacred and important Aboriginal culture was in our land, and the sheer size of it is massive. Okay, so something in Wiradjuri country wouldn't be the same here in Darkinjung country, wouldn't be the same in Ku-ring-gai country, and that's only the slight little small three nations we have there. Wiradjuri is quite big, actually, but you extend that across the whole of the continent that is Australia, and it paints a picture of a culture that's extremely diverse, which now, though, only 13 traditional Indigenous languages are taught to children explicitly, and we have over 100 dialects spoken to varying degrees by older generations, but a lot of those are still at risk of dying with the last elders with no one to pass it down to. So we can see that a lot of these Indigenous nations were completely wiped out. Most of them were completely wiped out, and there's no one to pass down the oral history and traditions of Aboriginal people. which is a real shame. So a lot of it's lost. However, when we're moving forward into our topic, I think it's just important to realise the dense complexity that we're facing with here. Okay, these are nations. These are as different as France and Italy, as Spain and Portugal. Okay, yeah, there might be some similarities, but they're countries within their own right. Bit of a background information here for us, guys. So in terms of population, there was no accurate estimates before European invasion. Estimates of the population are obviously based on 1788 from written observations from British settlers. And the number, or the range of numbers that is kind of thrown around, is 300,000 to around 1 million, thereabouts. However, if we look at, ABS did an archaeological evidence study, and they think that 750,000 Indigenous peoples could have been sustained across the continent. But there are a lot of studies to say there's a lot more, and a lot to say there's a lot less. So the true figure is unknown to us at this stage. Aboriginal people lived in small family groups and were semi-nomadic. Now, that's not to say every group was a small family group, and what I mean by small family group, could be 10 to 20, could be 20 to 100. You typically wouldn't have had many larger than 100, 150 maybe. I think there were some instances in some parts of the country where you would sustain numbers of that big, but typically they were smaller family groups that were semi-nomadic. So some were nomadic and moved around from land within their nation, from different spots to different spots as they went. So a nomad is someone who doesn't have like you and me, we have a house, we stay very sedentary within our own house for most of our lives, whereas semi-nomadic people move around according to the seasons. They might move around according to different weather patterns and hunting seasons as well. So they don't have a certain one spot that they call home. They call home to many different areas. Although that's not to say that Aboriginal people didn't do that. There's a lot of evidence in a book called Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe that many Aboriginal nations and countries did in fact have settlements and stayed in the same places year round and built houses and fence lines similar to kind of what we do today. So there's that too. However, most were semi-nomadic, with each group living in a defined territory by their totems and systemically moving around, typically due to seasonal changes. Each group had their own distinct history and culture as well. So you might have had within Wiradjuri country a lot of different family groups speaking the same language, but you would have had a lot of dialect changes in there. You would have had a lot of distinctions between their own history and culture of their own mob and things like that. So even within their countries, similar to us, I guess, guys, that, you might be very similar to your friends' families, but you have your own traditions, you have your own kind of inside jokes and histories. It would have been the same here with Aboriginal Australians. Now, membership of each family is typically based on birthright, shared language, cultural obligations and responsibilities, and that these relationships within groups are predetermined categories of responsibilities. So if we look at the semi-permanent dwellings that I was talking about earlier, you range from that to a completely nomadic society. So it really is quite a stark distinction, than the development of an 100% agrarian society. Agrarian meaning agricultural, farming and housing. So whereas most other countries in the Western world, we would say were almost purely agrarian societies, in Aboriginal Australia that was not the case. We did have an example of some. Some would farm national yams and do a lot of yam farming and a certain type of wheat crop. However, most, as I said before, were semi-nomadic. What this meant was that they were relatively non-materialistic, and that a lot of their emphasis, so very much different to Western culture where we're quite materialistic, their greatest emphasis was based on the social, religious and spiritual activities of the time. Now, obviously prior and up until 1788, and even beyond for some living cultures that are still around today, they do flourish in a diverse environment. Aboriginal people always respected land, sustaining flora and fauna throughout, and they were very complex societies with their own social, legal organisation and land rights embedded within their own societies. So they weren't, the word primitive doesn't describe them. They're extremely complex, had a lot of law, L-O-R-E, as well as L-A-W, and a lot of these were based around different nations. So similar to how, but way back when it's kind of forbidden to trespass on other people's countries, we had the same thing here in Australia. The laws surrounding that, determining on where you could go, who you could marry, who you could break bread with, were all very different and very, very complex. This, however, was taken away by colonisation and invasion. What the British failed to recognise was this complexity. The word terra nullius, meaning land belonging to no one, blatantly ignored the social, legal organisation and land rights that Aboriginal people had in our country. And by exterminating them, they left a lot of these traditions, languages and social structures behind. And since then, this is where our study kicks in, they have created, the British people, social disadvantage and exclusion across every socially valued resource that we have. Now, when we're looking across all these SVRs, for most areas, we're talking deep social exclusion, not just marginal social exclusion like we looked at with that reading, but Aboriginal peoples in Australia are facing deep social exclusion across almost every SVR, because the stark difference due to this, and it stems from here, 1788, it all comes back to this, the invasion, the stolen generations, taken away from families, all of that has a huge, huge, huge impact on future life chances, social mobility, and the life course, which we're going to be looking at. So when it comes down to it, and I would highlight this one, is that the truth of the matter really is that the Australian colony was built on racism, it was built on genocide, and it's written into our laws and operates within our institutions to this day. Now, there are many areas in which this is improving and getting better, but we still have a long, long way to go in terms of having true equity for Aboriginal people, and even better still, justice. We're not quite there with justice at all. So systemic racism, to fix that, it requires systemic change, and to date we haven't seen much systemic change at a really deep, core, meaningful level to help redress this. So that's a bit of a background. What we'll look at now is our current day and where this social exclusion is facing, and the percentages and all the stats and data surrounding that. So currently, these stats and these following stats are really important to note. So I don't know how you want to study those, or how best to commit these to memory. I know you guys have a lot of good study techniques out there that I've taught you over the years, but it's really important to, I guess, know these last few things here. One is that Aboriginal Australians comprise over 3%, just over 3%, I think it's 3.1, 3.2%, percent of Australia's total population, which equates to about 800,000 people today. Now, this stat that I have is from 2016, so there's a bit more now, with most Indigenous Australians living in what we would call an urban environment. So an urban environment is very much what we live here in on the Central Coast. We have fairly sizable cities and townships. We have access to every SVR, within 10, 15 minutes of our house, if not even shorter. And we typically enjoy a really high quality of life in an urban environment. Where that changes is when you go to regional areas. So you go out to areas like Bulahdelah, Mudgee, Gunnedah, Moree. These are more regional areas or rural areas. And then you also have the remote and very remote areas, which is our townships in Alice Springs, Broken Hill. Kind of the further west you go and the more inland to Australia you go, the less urban you become and the more rural and remote that you become. So with that, 20% of Australian Aboriginals, 20% of Aboriginal Australians, live in rural and remote areas. So 80% are living in cities and urban areas. So 20% live in those areas. However, they make up 50% of the population within those areas. So there is a higher percentage and concentration of Aboriginal Australians the more remote you go. And we also know that the more remote we go, based off our reading and coursework in the last few lessons, is the more likely you are to experience social exclusion. Whether you're Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal, you're more likely to experience social exclusion the more west you go. But for Aboriginal Australians, that gap, as we know, gets even more severe. I think the reason the majority of Aboriginal Australians live in cities and non-remote locations is similar to a lot of reasons that we do. We're more likely to be serviced by government and non-government organisations. We have greater access to SVRs, higher standards of living. But due to the urban environment having a higher population, it naturally attracts and increases the demand for higher levels of resources that we do. But even despite this, the majority of Aboriginal Australians, even if they do live in urban areas and enjoy, I guess, all the close proximity and being in close vicinity to all these SVRs and services, they still face deep social exclusion. And what this does is it makes the disproportionate exclusion. Disproportionate is a word we're going to use a lot here. Disproportionate means that it means that something is either too large or too small when you're comparing it to another group or another thing. So when we look at the justice system, for example, which we're going to look at next lesson, so we know that Aboriginal Australians represent 3% of the population. However, they make up for over 30% of the prison population, despite only making up 3% of the total Australian population. So that is a disproportionate statistic, because that would mean, or that implies, and it's true, that if you're Aboriginal Australian, you are 10 times more likely to go to jail than a non-Indigenous person. So that's disproportionate. So when we talk about disproportionate exclusion, the gap is too large when comparing to similar things. So that's where the problem lies. Now, this little graph here is looking at the percentage of Indigenous to non-Indigenous people that live in urban and rural and remote areas, and it goes all the way from major cities, inner regional, outer remote and very remote. So your major cities are our capital cities in Australia. Inner regional, we're sort of a blend between these two, where we are in the Central Coast. And then you've got the outer regional, that's kind of, think of things like Bathurst there. Remote is where we're starting to look at the Moree sort of areas, and then very remote, we're looking at Alice Springs, Broken Hill, and that sort of thing. But if we look at the difference between the percentage of populations compared to Indigenous and non-Indigenous, we can see that in very remote areas there's hardly any non-Indigenous Australians, so 14% make up for it there. Okay, so that's roughly 28 times more likely there. So we can see that the SVR gap, the more remote you go, we know the worse it gets, and that's why when we're talking about remote areas for Aboriginal Australians, that socially valued resource gap is huge. What I'll get you to do now is, there is a reading, or a critical reading. I'll leave these printed out on the library counter, and what this reading looks at is the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey, or NATSIS for short. Now they conduct this every 6 or 7 years. There's actually one due this year, but it hasn't been released yet. So I've just got the 2014 to 2015 one here for you. But basically they look at key areas of progress, and a lot of these align with our socially valued resources. So something like education, healthcare, housing. We don't have a language and culture one. Social networks and well-being, so that kind of links to healthcare somewhat. Employment's another SVR we have. And safety, law and justice, so that's our justice system. Housing is another SVR. So what I want you to do as you're reading this is to highlight the key statistics and really look at areas I think that stand out to you, and they break it up between children's typically 0 to 14, and then people age 15 and over. And this is just a stat bomb of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social exclusion. So if we look at here, for example, about 6 out of 10 Aboriginal people aged 15 years or older were living in a household in which there was at least one daily smoker. So that's a massive statistic, because if you look at, pretty sure the last time I looked, for the whole of Australia, about 16% of households have at least one smoker. So we're looking at, if that's 15%, that's you're almost 3.5 times more likely to have a smoker if living in an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person's household. So again, the gap there in healthcare is disproportionate here. So what I want you to do is look at some of these key statistics, and if you can, under each heading, write a little table that looks at these stats so that you guys can have a quick one-page wonder reference of these statistics. So you might even write them under our SVR headings. For this one, change it to justice system. But just these quick snapshots, so you don't need to write out this whole thing, but you might do something like 50% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, you might write 50% of Aboriginal people have experienced physical violence in the last 12 months from a family member. That might be the quick, short stat. Once you've made that table, what I want you to do is create a non-Indigenous table, and I want you to look up online the stats for non-Indigenous, or even if you just look at Australia in general, which will still count the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander percentage within that. But what you'll find, I guarantee you, across every single one, you will find that the ATSI rate is higher by at least 2 or 3 times the amount. So that's what I want you to do. So to be really clear again on what I want you to do, I want you to, 1, complete this reading as your critical reading. Second thing is I want you to make headings across each of these areas. So I'm going to create the following headings. 1, education. 2, call that healthcare. 3, housing. 4, employment. 5, the justice system. And 6, the housing. So under those headings, we're getting most of our SVRs. I think the only one that's missing from here is technology. But if you write across those 5 or 6 key headings there, we've got education, healthcare, housing, employment, the justice system. They're the 5 key ones that are addressed here. If you do find any technology stats, feel free to add them. But across those 5 main areas, I want you to write down at least 3 or 4, 3 minimum, 5 max, of just bits of data regarding education, housing, and issues like we just talked about there. So you might say, like this stat here that we looked at, half of Aboriginal and Torres Strait have experienced physical violence in the last 12 months. Okay. Once you've written that stat down, I then want you to, in your next table column, where it says non-Indigenous, I want you to look up how many people have experienced that violence. And if I look here, the quick stat here from Mission Australia, this is related to family violence. Typically, most of the violence happens there. You have 1 in 5 women and 1 in 20 men. So as a statistic or percentage here, actually this is even a better source from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, which is where I've gotten most of our data from. 18% for women and 4.7% for men. If we combine that, that's what, 20, let's say roughly 23%. We then go back to our reading here, 23% compared to 50%. So it's more than double already. So that's the kind of thing I want you to do in your table and go through that, and then maybe even have a third column, or even just next to the end of the table, write what the percentage difference is. You might write 2 times more likely, or you might write whatever the remaining percentage is. 23, in that case it would be what, 20, 2% more likely, which is 2 times more likely. So if we do that and you do it that way, I think that's going to be our really good critical reading activity for this lesson. If you're unsure of that, just come and see me and I'll lay it out. I'll explain it a bit better on Tuesday as well, even though I think I explained it pretty well then. What I then want you to do here, this is a bit of a data snapshot as our last activity. These are across our 6 socially valued resources: healthcare, employment, education, justice system, housing, and technologies. Now, in doing this activity, this is just a quick snapshot. We are going to go into more detail on this in every single lesson henceforth, but this is a quick snapshot of some raw data against this. So I'd take note of this page. You might even want to do a little concept card on these statistics. It's probably a good idea. So we have Indigenous and non-Indigenous column here. So in healthcare, I've looked at life expectancy. So if you are Indigenous, your life expectancy for male is 71 to 75 for female, and then for non-Indigenous, 81 to 85. So next to here, I just want you to tell me what the gap is. So the gap here for me is 10 years across both genders. That's the gap here. So we talk about a lot about closing the gap, or you've heard about probably that saying a lot. I want you to identify what the gap is between these two things, okay? So infant mortality rates. So infant mortality is deaths in children under the age of 1. For Indigenous people, it's 6 per 1,000. For non-Indigenous, it's 2 per 1,000. So tell me what the difference is there. The employment rate here, tell me what it is there. The stat of completing year 12, that one always hits me hard as a teacher, but what's that gap there, you know? And this is what I was saying before. If we look at juveniles, 57% of the prison population accounts for Indigenous people. You are more likely, as a young Indigenous person, or a young Aboriginal person, to go to juvenile detention than you are to finish year 12. That's scary. But anyway, so next to here, I want you to write what the gap is across each of those things, and then do that table for your critical reading, and that's your lesson 6 done today. Thank you very much.